There's a picture you've kept somewhere, pinned to a wall, saved in a folder, maybe just held in your head because you never needed to print it out to remember it. A version of your life you wanted badly enough to give it a shape, a face, a set of details you could point to and say, That's what I mean when I say I want more. Maybe you look at it now and feel something has shifted, quietly, in a way you can't quite date. Or maybe you look at it and still feel the old distance, the sense that it belongs to someone who hasn't arrived yet. Both of those are common, and neither one is wrong. What matters more than which one you are right now is what the picture was actually asking of you the whole time, which was never really about arriving on schedule. It was about a feeling you didn't have words for yet, and a willingness to keep facing its direction even without proof. The picture itself was never really the point. It was never about the exact job, the exact home, the exact number, the exact version of a life. It was a way of giving shape to something harder to name, a way of pointing at a feeling and saying, whatever that is, I want to know it's possible for someone like me. The details on that picture have probably changed meaning over time, even if the image hasn't. What once felt essential, the specific title, the specific address, the specific number in the bank account, starts to matter less than something quieter and harder to photograph, the feeling of having stopped apologizing for wanting what you want. You can hold the same picture for years and still watch its meaning shift underneath your hands. The way a word said too many times starts to sound different, not because the word changed, but because you did. That feeling doesn't arrive all at once, and it rarely arrives the way you picture it arriving. It usually starts underneath a doubt that doesn't announce itself as doubt. It sounds reasonable instead. It sounds like patience, like realism, like being honest about the odds. That voice can be loud or quiet depending on the day, and it isn't protecting you from failure so much as protecting you from wanting something fully and not getting it. A want kept small can be disappointed without unraveling you. A full want, spoken plainly, can actually hurt if it doesn't land, so the doubt offers a trade, over and over. Want a little less, and you'll hurt a little less. You might take that trade for years without noticing you're taking it. You might be taking it right now, quietly deciding that this doesn't quite apply to you, that your doubt is more accurate than the ordinary kind, which is one of doubt's oldest tricks, convincing you it's the exception rather than the rule. It might be accurate, some doubts are, or it might just be old, inherited from an earlier version of your life that no longer applies but never got formally retired, sitting in the back of your mind the way an old warning sign stays up long after the road it was warning about has been repaved. Usually only time, and what you do despite the doubt, answers which one it was. And what seems to be true, for the people who eventually get near their own picture, is that the doubt doesn't have to disappear first. They proceed while it's still talking, sometimes loudly, sometimes for years, and somewhere inside all that continuing, it quiets down on its own schedule, not because it lost an argument, not because it was silenced in some dramatic confrontation, but because it slowly stopped being relevant to a life that kept moving without waiting for its permission. Doubt doesn't get defeated so much as it gets outlived. That continuing is where the difference between patience and quiet surrender starts to matter, because the two can look identical from the outside while meaning completely different things underneath. Patiently waiting for something you still believe in and quietly giving up on it while calling the giving up patience because that word feels gentler. Those aren't the same thing, even though they wear the same expression, the same calm exterior, the same reasonable tone when you explain your situation to someone else. There isn't a clean test for which one you're doing, but there's a question that tends to be more honest than most. Are you still doing anything, however small, however unglamorous, that moves you toward the picture, or has the picture become something you visit emotionally without ever approaching it practically? Patience without movement usually isn't patience. Movement without patience usually burns out fast and leaves you further from where you started than when you began. The people who eventually recognize themselves somewhere in their own picture tend to have practiced some uneven, imperfect mix of both, not gracefully, not on a consistent schedule, just enough that neither doubt nor exhaustion got the final vote over their direction. Somewhere in that long stretch of continuing, comparison shows up too, usually uninvited, usually late at night or first thing in the morning, in the quiet minutes before you've fully woken up and put your guard back on. You measure your picture against someone else's progress, a scroll-length moment, an overheard conversation, the particular ache of watching someone who started later than you arrive somewhere sooner, moving through a door that still feels closed to you. What makes comparison so unreliable is that you're almost never comparing like for like. You're comparing your own unfinished middle to someone else's polished beginning or curated ending, and you don't have access to their private doubt, their setbacks, their long, unglamorous stretches, only the parts they happen to show, edited, framed, chosen deliberately to be seen. Comparison feels like it's measuring how far behind you are. It's actually measuring position instead of direction, and two people can stand at wildly different points along the same picture while both still moving toward it, at speeds that have very little to do with who deserves to arrive first, or who worked harder, or who wanted it more. There's a quieter guilt that tends to live near all of this, one that rarely gets spoken about directly. It's the strange discomfort of wanting more when the life you already have looks, from the outside, like enough. Maybe people around you have told you, kindly or not, that you should be grateful for what you have, and you are, genuinely, and still the wanting doesn't stop just because the gratitude is real. It can feel almost shameful to admit that a good life and a bigger want can exist in the same body at the same time, as if wanting more is a quiet insult to everything you already have. But gratitude was never supposed to be a ceiling. It's possible to be thankful for a table and still want to build a bigger one, without that wanting canceling out the thanks. The guilt tends to soften once you stop treating ambition and gratitude as opposites competing for the same space, and start treating them as two things that were always allowed to sit together. There's another kind of weight that shows up too, one that has less to do with yourself and more to do with the people who believed in you early, before there was any proof to justify it. Someone, at some point, probably looked at you before you'd accomplished anything resembling the picture and believed in it anyway, on nothing but your word and their own hope for you. That kind of early belief is a gift, and it can also, quietly, become a pressure. The fear of disappointing someone who trusted you before you'd earned it. The worry that if it doesn't work out, you won't just be letting yourself down, you'll be proving their faith was misplaced. That fear is real, and it's also worth setting down gently when you can, because their belief in you was never actually a contract. It was a gift freely given, not a debt you now owe proof of. You don't have to earn after the fact a belief that was already offered to you before you had anything to show for it. All of that, the doubt, the blurred line between patience and surrender, the comparison that shows up uninvited, the guilt of wanting more, the weight of being believed in, tends to wear a person down eventually, and that particular tiredness isn't really about the goal itself. It's about the wanting something for a long time without guaranteed proof it's coming, is its own kind of labor, separate from whatever the goal actually requires of you practically. There's a pull, somewhere in the middle of that labor, to simply stop wanting so specifically, to let the picture soften into something vaguer, something that can't disappoint you because you've already stopped asking anything sharp of it, the way you might deliberately blur a photograph so a flaw in it stops being visible. That pull isn't a sign of weakness, and it doesn't disappear once you get closer either. Sometimes it sharpens the closer you get, because the closer you get, the more there is to lose if it doesn't land the way you'd pictured for so long. The more embarrassing it would feel to have wanted something this openly and still not gotten it. What distinguishes the people who eventually get there isn't the absence of that pull, it's what they do in the specific moment it shows up. Some soften the want and let it go, and that's a valid choice too. Not everything we picture for ourselves is meant to be permanent, and releasing a version of a dream isn't automatically a failure. Others feel the pull fully, without pretending it isn't there, and continue anyway, not because the tiredness went away, but because they decided the wanting was still worth carrying, tired or not, unproven or not. If you keep carrying it, something starts to change, though rarely in a way that announces itself with any ceremony. If change were loud, it would be easier to track, easier to point to, easier to celebrate. It isn't. It happens in places too small to notice while it's happening, in ordinary moments that don't feel like turning points at the time, and becomes visible only afterward, if at all, usually only to the person it happened to. Maybe you've noticed a conversation you didn't shrink from the way you used to, a want you said out loud without qualifying it first, without immediately softening it into something safer to admit. Maybe there's been a morning the doubt just didn't show up on schedule, and you only noticed its absence hours later, the way you notice a headache is gone only once your attention has already moved elsewhere. Or maybe nothing feels different yet, the picture no closer, the feeling the same as it's been for a long while. And that's ordinary too, more ordinary than anyone tends to admit out loud. The absence of visible change isn't proof nothing is happening underneath. Most people move through long stretches where nothing seems different, followed by a moment where they suddenly notice something has actually been different for a while, without their realizing it as it unfolded. The way you might suddenly notice a plant has grown, only when you finally stop to look closely at it. This is where the real difference starts to show between waiting for the picture to become true and becoming the kind of person it depicts, regardless of whether the external proof has caught up yet. Waiting keeps the picture outside you, a future event dependent on timing and circumstance as much as effort, something that has to be granted rather than built. Becoming keeps it inside you instead, a way of carrying yourself through ordinary days, ordinary conversations, ordinary decisions that doesn't need the proof to arrive first as a precondition. Becoming doesn't guarantee the external picture will match your mental image exactly. Life rarely delivers things pixel for pixel, detail for detail, the way you imagined them on your best, most hopeful days, but something closer to the actual feeling behind the picture, the ease, the quiet confidence, the sense of having arrived somewhere real and solid rather than borrowed, tends to become available through becoming in a way it never is through waiting alone, because becoming was never dependent on permission arriving first from anywhere outside yourself. Becoming that fully is its own kind of risk, because somewhere along the way most people learn to want things carefully, a little quieter than they actually feel, a little smaller than the true size of the hope, just in case it doesn't work out the way they'd hoped. It's self-protection that makes sense on its own terms. A carefully sized want is easier to survive losing than a full, unguarded one. But wanting something only halfway tends to produce halfway effort and halfway belief in return, not because you're lazy or undisciplined, but because it's genuinely hard to move fully towards something you've deliberately kept small in your own mind as a kind of armor. There's no way to guarantee that wanting something fully will make it arrive any faster. It doesn't work like a formula, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something simpler than the truth. But it does seem to change the way you move toward it, the risks you become willing to take, the rooms you become willing to walk into uninvited, the version of yourself you become willing to practice being long before you have any proof it was warranted or deserved. Most of this practicing happens in a stretch that almost nobody talks about honestly, because it doesn't make a satisfying story afterward, the kind you could tell cleanly at a dinner table, with a beginning, middle, and end. It's the part after the initial decision to keep going, but well before anything resembling arrival. Nothing dramatic happens there. The picture doesn't get noticeably closer in any way you can measure precisely. The doubt still visits sometimes, and asks its old questions again, as if they hadn't already been answered 100 times before, as if it hadn't already lost every argument, and simply refused to leave the room. That stretch is unglamorous by nature. There's no highlight reel for it, no clean before and after photograph to capture it, nothing you could post that would fully explain what it felt like to be inside it. It's just the accumulation of ordinary days spent facing the same direction, again and again, without much evidence any of it adds up to anything at all. And yet, by every account from people who eventually arrived somewhere close to their own picture, that stretch turns out to be where almost everything actually happened, quietly, invisibly, without ceremony, without anyone else knowing it was even taking place. Part of what makes that stretch bearable is a kind of promise you make to yourself that nobody else is tracking. Not a public declaration, not a goal shared for accountability, just a private decision to keep showing up, to keep facing the same direction, to keep trying even when there's no witness to confirm you did. There's a particular cost to keeping a promise like that. Nobody applauds you for it, because nobody knows it happened. Nobody would even know if you quietly broke it, some ordinary Tuesday, and let yourself off the hook. That invisibility is exactly what makes it matter. A promise kept only for yourself, with nothing external writing on it, tends to build something sturdier than a promise kept for an audience, a kind of trust in your own word that doesn't depend on anyone else witnessing it. That trust becomes its own quiet form of the picture arriving, long before the external version does. Some of what happens in that stretch is easier to carry privately than out loud, and some of it inevitably becomes visible, whether you meant it to or not. There's a particular exposure in letting people watch you attempt something before you know whether it will work, in saying the thing out loud, letting the wanting become visible, accepting that some portion of the people around you are now quietly watching to see whether it happens, whether you were serious, whether this was just talk. There's no rule that says the effort has to be visible to count. Plenty of people move toward their own picture without telling anyone at all, and their progress is no less real for having happened in private. But it's worth noticing, gently, whether the privacy you've chosen is protecting your peace, or whether it's protecting you from the discomfort of being watched while still uncertain, still unproven, still in the middle of something that might not work. Either way, the people who eventually recognize themselves in their own picture tend to stop needing the watching to validate the trying. The visibility, or the privacy, becomes secondary to the simple fact that they kept moving regardless of who was or wasn't paying attention, regardless of who believed them. And even once they arrive somewhere near it, not everything changes, and it isn't supposed to. Some of the same fears that visited early on will likely still visit later, even closer to the picture, even after real, undeniable progress. This can feel disappointing if you expected transformation to mean becoming an entirely different person, someone finally immune to the old worries. It rarely works that way. What changes isn't the presence of every fear, but your relationship to it. The same worry might still show up on a random afternoon, uninvited as always, but it no longer gets the final say in what you do next. If you were hoping arrival would mean the complete end of self-doubt, it might help to release that particular expectation now, gently, rather than being surprised by its quiet, persistent return later. Underneath all of it, the doubt, the comparison, the guilt of wanting more, the weight of being believed in, the long middle, the private promise, the exposure of being watched, the fears that don't fully leave even after everything else has changed, there's usually one question doing most of the work, whether or not you've ever said it out loud in these exact words. It isn't really will I get what's in the picture. It's closer to something like, am I the kind of person this is allowed to happen for? That's the real question underneath the picture, for almost everyone, whether they're standing close to it or still far away, whether they know it consciously or only feel its shape indirectly. Nobody else can answer that question for you, and no amount of outside encouragement fully settles it either. You can be told 100 times that you deserve what you want, and still privately withhold your own belief in it, the way a door can be unlocked, and still feel closed if you've never actually tried the handle. That belief tends to get built slowly instead, through small evidence you gather for yourself, rather than delivered all at once from somewhere outside. A promise you kept when it would have been easier not to, a hard conversation you didn't avoid, a morning you showed up despite not wanting to, despite every reasonable excuse available to you. None of these moments look significant while they're happening. They rarely announce themselves as important, but they accumulate, quietly, the same way doubt accumulates when left unchallenged, except moving in the opposite direction, building something instead of eroding it. That accumulation is what the picture is actually made of, underneath all the more visible, more photographable parts of the story. If there's anything worth carrying out of all this, it's that the picture was never really asking you to arrive by a certain date, or match its details exactly, or prove anything to anyone who happened to be watching. It was only ever asking you to keep facing its direction, on the ordinary days as much as the meaningful ones, whether or not you had any evidence yet that it was working. Wherever you are right now in relation to it, you're allowed to still be exactly there. The picture isn't going anywhere without you, and neither, it turns out, are you, as long as you keep quietly facing it, one ordinary day after another, whether or not anyone else ever notices you doing it.